The amount of times I have tried to put this video together is nobody's business. Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I come to you in a jumper that is now supremely too big for me in order to give you my reviews and rankings for the final round of the Booktube Prize. The Booktube Prize is an annual event hosted by Robert of Barterhoords when an entire community come together in order to decide what we believe is the best book of 2020. So what I will do first is I will show you what books made it to the final round, give you my reviews of the 2 books that I haven't read, and then get into telling you how I ranked these books and why. In alphabetical order, we have The Vanishing Half by Brit, Bennett, The Death of Vivek by Akwaeke Emezi, Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell, The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickels, and Sukibane by Douglas Stuart. Going into this round, the only 2 books that I had to read were The Vanishing Half and Sukibane, so I will give my reviews of them here. The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett riffs on Passing by Nella Larson and sees 2 twin sisters from a town in which black people are able to pass as white decide to leave town. One of the sisters goes on to pass as a white woman and one of them ends up returning to the town after things go awry. I did not give The Mothers by Brit Bennett a favourable review a few years ago, and so I had no intentions of reading The Vanishing Half. Had it not been for the Booktube Prize, I would not have read this book. In reading this book, I can see how Brit Bennett has advanced as a writer. However, I did not particularly enjoy the way that this story used coincidences in order to further its narrative. It's an incredibly short book, and I think that is to its benefit, really. I think that the author knows what parts of the story need to be included to make the strongest possible tale. However, as I say, the coincidences put me off. I found it somewhat predictable, but it is a book that I was able to keep reading. I read rather quickly, and I was able to recognise why other people might like this book. Here, there was a strong narratorial voice. Now, with The Mothers a few years ago, that tried to have a strong narratorial voice, and I felt as though that was something it fell short of doing. I think that here, Bennett has shown improvement from that, and I would look forward to seeing how her career is going to go and how her writing is going to progress, because I think that here we have something that's done what books should do and has managed to improve upon that last book. I think that in terms of discussing relationships, particularly familial relationships, it did well, and I think that this time we had a story that went through generations and we were able to see this generational shift. It also helped to show us 2 different parts of society. Now, there was something to me that was a bit similar to Double Act by Jacqueline Wilson from when I was younger, in which you had 2 twins who were decidedly different from one another, and we followed them explaining how they were different and how they'd separated from one another. Here, I think that this book is also a good exploration of showing how sometimes we need to separate from what we know in order to truly find ourselves. I think that there is something to be said about the way we believe life could go. I think there's, as opposed to how it does go, I think that we get a good discussion on what it means to pass, and it doesn't just come in the form of discussing how certain black people are able to pass as white. It also discusses in small ways how certain other communities are able to pass as well, and how perception in society is often all it takes to garner respect. Those are the thoughts that I have about the Vanishing Half, let's move on to Sukibane. So this book, we know this book won the Booker, and I will say that before reading this book, I also did not have plans to read this because I have been disappointed by Booker books over the last few years. I had heard things where people were talking about this book and they came from certain backgrounds, and we know how I feel about the upper classes, really. I don't denigrate them, I have nothing against them, but I felt like there was a lot of middle class guilt that went into giving this book favourable reviews, and I still don't know how I feel about that. I thought that it did a good job of showing what communities are like on council estates in more impoverished backgrounds. I have lived in council housing my entire life, and so I know it's different in Scotland, I'm not saying that, but here we have a book in which, whilst it's called Sukibane, the focus seems to be on his mother and how her actions have affected the world around her. His mother is an alcoholic and isn't really doing her best for her children. However, I think that when it comes to my knowledge of what basically there's a lot in this book that I have seen, and I know from where I live these things go on. And so whilst I thought that this was an accurate portrayal, and I appreciated the fact that the author didn't shy away from anything, he showed the gritty stuff, it didn't really feel gritty and dramatic to me, and I didn't like how certain people have made out like it's a tragedy to live like this when so many people actually do live like this. And it's one of those things where, whilst I think that it's a great narrative and this might be the narrative that Stuart wanted to tell, obviously he did, he published it and it won an award, I don't often care for the types of narratives where we're shown working class, social underclass folk as always having bleak lives. And there was something Dickensian in the scope of this story, in the way that we didn't just focus on Shuggie or his mother, we went and explored the lives of other people. Also in the way that from the cover, we have the black and white cover, and everything in here seems grey, gritty and dirty. And when I say gritty, I don't mean it in the way that we've probably come to mean it. I mean that there seems to be a layer of filth and dirt that no matter how clean Agnes keeps her house, we are unable to shed throughout the reading of this narrative. Shuggie is beginning to explore his sexuality even before but he doesn't really know what his sexuality is or why he has certain feelings, and I thought that it was a good representation of that, in that other people already have a perception of him and they know who he is before he is that way. I liked the support he received from his brother in showing him how perhaps he'll have to behave in order to get by in the society in which they live. It seemed very telling. I like the fact that he came from a bigger family, coming from a rather big family myself. Although I could see all of these very realistic things, and although I think that this is a sublime book, I think it's brilliant, I still just feel as though, has it done so well because of people not recognising that there are communities like this? Because when I read something that feels to me very true to life, I'm left feeling, well, I know this life and I know what it's like, and I'm grateful for an accurate portrayal in fiction, but I also wonder why we can't have happier narratives about these lives and these situations. Why do we always have to make out like lives for people who have to live in council accommodation, have to go on benefits? Why do we always have to make out like those are the bleakest lives lived? I just don't understand that. And I know that's for me to think about as a reader, as opposed to what the writer's doing with this book. I can't help thinking that there's a lot of guilt that went into this book doing so well, because at the end of the day, it's a story I know well. Close to the beginning of the book, there's a very vivid image of Agnes's scalp being torn when she's dragged by her hair, and it just reminded me of a situation when I was younger, in which a young family at the bottom of my street, the man in the relationship dragged a woman down the street by her hair. Police were involved, children were sent back into the houses, and all the adults on the street rushed down to help her. But it's one of those things where I recognise so much of what's going on in here, so at the end of the day there ends up being something predictable about that. And so it's true to life, and it's brilliant, and I'm keeping the book on my shelves because I think that Stuart is a fantastic writer, and I can understand why this won an award, but I don't particularly care for such a bleak observation of a life of which I know. Regardless of all that, characterisation within this book is good. The setting, as I say, fantastic, and I think that it's not an enjoyable read, but it's one I can appreciate. Let us begin with my rankings. We had 6 books to read, and so 6 books are ranked, and coming in at the bottom was My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. I am sorry, I don't understand how this book did so well. For me, it was not the best written book. It held my attention, but I think that there were too many heavy-handed references to Lolita, and I think that it isn't necessarily the best told story on this list, and I was a bit dismayed to even see that it made it to the final round. However, I will go on and admit that I do think this was a really strong final round, and I did find it difficult to pick how I would rank the next 5. So coming in at 5th, we actually have The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickels. Now, I really adore this book, and I read this a few months ago alongside How to Survive a Plague by David France, and I think that these books complement each other extremely well. The Prettiest Star is set during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and involves a young gay man returning to his very Christian conservative household with an AIDS diagnosis at a time in which people were fed a lot of misinformation. He was being maligned like a leper in the Bible, and it was short, brief, but full of character. However, in terms, when it came to ranking these books, for me, there were some books that just did more. So coming in at 4th, we have The Death of Vivek OJ by Akwaeke Emezi. This book as well, when I read this earlier this year, I believe this book, or did I read this last year? Whenever I read this book, I thought that it was brilliant, and I still believe that. However, when it came to ranking these books, this book came in 4th simply because there is a scene towards the end, and I had to be nitpicky here. There was one scene towards the end that pulled me out of the narrative, and that's the one that stuck in my head because it's the one that I've always held the most umbrage for, from what I think is otherwise a brilliantly told tale. Coming in at 3rd, we have The Vanishing Half by Bennett. It was a surprise to me that this made it so high in my rankings, but I began to think about what I wanted to see in the top here, and so I went with something that was more of a fully formed narrative that was realised with a strong narratorial voice, and where I felt like the author had achieved everything that they set out to do, and therefore this book came in 3rd. In 2nd, I have Sukibane by Douglas Stuart. Now this is where I really struggled to figure out my top 2 books. I actually went to Charlie of Charlie Brooke whilst I was struggling. Charlie is not a judge in this. She has no bet on the horses here. Whatever you want to say, she didn't have an horse in this competition. I don't know. Either way, she helped me figure out how best to navigate what I wanted to be, what I thought was the top book. And she said which would be the easiest writer for me to reach for. And Douglas Stuart, I need to see what other narratives this writer can conjure. And this, as I said in my review, there's just something where, whilst I thought this was a fully realised story, I needed a few more moments of light, and I needed us to recognise that this way of living, and I don't mean Agnes's alcoholism, I just mean the community they live in, I need us to stop perpetuating the idea that it is the worst possible way of living, and to acknowledge that we do have communities and we do get on with one another and we uplift each other. And yes, I don't deny that there are arguments, there are rows and that sort of thing, but I just am getting a bit fed up of constant bleak narratives set in these communities, which is why Hamnet ends up coming in first place, because Hamnet was one of my favourite books of last year. I have famously not got on with Maggie O'Farrell's work in the past, but this was a beautiful exploration of grief. I felt that it discussed the themes incredibly well, was a fully realised story, and at its heart is this tale of motherhood, what it meant to be a woman at the time, and was also an incredibly timely book. There were hints of magic in here that sometimes reminded me of Joanne Harris, and it just captured and evoked the setting, the time, and the characters incredibly well, which is why this was my favoured pick of the Booktube Prize. And I have to admit that since we started reading these books back in January, this was perhaps the book that I wanted to win above all others. So I was thrilled by Robert's announcement on Sunday that Hamnet did go on to win. Another reason I was a bit thrilled by that is because this means that I've now picked the winner 2 years in a row. I also got the second book correct with Shuggie Bain, and the fact that The Prettiest star came in third thrilled me because I did love that book. I do love that book, and if it wasn't such an expensive tome, I would own that book physically on my shelves, but I'm happy to keep it on Kindle because it was cheap to purchase. And that's all I'm going to say about that. I guess this is the place for you to chat to me about Shuggie Bain and the Vanishing Half in the comments. If your thoughts converge from mine at all, do let me know. If you want to discuss these books, please feel free to do so in the comments. Was this the way you expected the Booktube Prize to go? Are you happy or dismayed by the result? Let me know in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.